The Inquisition fractured along the grain of its oldest argument, whether mankind is saved by fear or by choice. Some lords of the Ordo Hereticus declared the Heartline a heretical lure and wrote manuals on how to burn it out of Vox systems. Their acolytes read those manuals and then left them on tables where dock workers could use the blank backs for tally sheets. A lord of the Ordo Xenos who had once lost a world to faith's certainty hung up his rosette and put on a portmaster's vest. He inventoried crates and wrote lists and learned that he slept better as a clerk than he ever had as a judge. On a bad night, he still woke with his fist closed, feeling for a seal that wasn't there. He would open his hand and whisper rest until it unclenched. Terra, the quiet heart, began to look like a city again. The sanctum's doors stayed shut, not locked. Gardens took root in courtyards built for parades. The Ministorum's last true zealots marched through the avenues carrying bones and glass and shouting for war. The people stepped aside and returned to their work. A custodian walked the perimeter wall at dusk, helm tucked under his arm, hair gone iron gray. A child matched his step for 20 paces and then asked if the Emperor was sleeping. He was tired, the custodian said. We are letting him rest. The child nodded and offered half a fruit. The custodian took it because refusing would have been a kind of blasphemy. The Heartline thickened into custom. Ships entering harbor thumped their hulls twice, a courtesy knock to the void. Dock crews answered with a tap on the gangway rail. Astartes learned to lower their voices in chapels that had become libraries. Tech priests, some of them not enough, began to test the old litanies against outcomes and kept the ones that matched. The Adeptus Arbites found their riot shields worked just as well when used to build flood walls. The new oath spoken at musters across 100 worlds had 5 words and no god in it. We keep each other alive. The warp noticed. Its storm still flared, but the peaks grew less jagged, the troughs less cruel. Demons came thinner, stretched, like shadows at noon. A few learned the new shape faster than the rest. They tried to whisper promises through the Heartline, and found their voices came out as requests. Please, instead of now. Those were the ones that bled when ignored. On a night when the sky over Terra was clearer than anyone had a right to expect, a signal arrived on an old rust-bitten frequency, the kind used by tugs and salvage rigs. It was a voice, male, rough, amused at itself. Dockmaster, request berth. We have clean water and a bad map. The dockmaster laughed and answered with coordinates. The voice came back softer. We heard the keeper. Thought you might need hands. The dockmaster looked up at the stars and, before keying the mic, put 2 fingers against his throat to feel his own pulse. He matched it to the Heartline, and the city felt all at once like a ship easing into harbor after a voyage too long and too hard for words. Somewhere far beyond, on a world of black glass, a light pulsed once, so faint it did not register on any instrument and went still again. As if smiling, the signal spread outward like a tide. What had once been a thin thread of rhythm now rolled through the void as if the galaxy itself had begun to breathe. Ships that had wandered for years without maps found their bearings by it. Astropaths learned to hum along under their breath while they worked. It wasn't worship. It was recognition, the quiet joy of hearing something that matched your own pulse. Planets began to chart themselves to the beat. No sector capitals, no segmentum borders, just a network of light where one heartbeat touched another. When a signal faltered, neighboring systems slowed their work, listened and found new routes to reach the silence. In time, a pattern took shape. The slow orbit of kindnesses. A freighter sent food to a colony it had never seen. A forge world crafted parts without commission. A regiment went to war not because someone ordered it, but because someone had to stand the line. The great institutions faded without collapse. The Adeptus Administratum dissolved into record keepers who traded facts instead of orders. The Mechanicus became a guild of patient engineers, more gardener than priest. The Astra Militarum broke into constellations of defense forces that called themselves shields instead of guards. None claimed command. They worked because work was what kept the dark from thinking it had won. Even the warp began to forget its shape. The storms weakened, folding in on themselves until travel no longer felt like crossing a scream. Demons still drifted, confused by the quiet. They tried to provoke the old terror, whispering promises of dominion, but most found their voices lost in the Heartline's rhythm. The warp fed on attention, and humanity was finally learning to stop staring into it. On one forgotten moon, a colony of exiled psychers built a temple without altars. They spent their days mapping dreams, their nights teaching children to control the brightness of their own minds. They discovered that when enough of them fell asleep together, the heartline grew louder, steadier, as if the galaxy was listening back. Their leader, a blind girl who had once been destined for sacrifice aboard a black ship, wrote a single sentence on the wall. The soul of man is not light, it is resonance. The Astartes who remained scattered across the rim carried their duty in silence. They no longer called it crusade. They called it stewardship. A squad of ultramarines rebuilt a dam on a desert world without declaring it victory. A lone Raven Guard taught farmers how to dig irrigation trenches at night to keep cool. A company of blood angels spent an entire season painting the names of the dead on the hulls of passing ships, turning battle scars into memory. When they left orbit, the locals sang to them, not as heroes, but as friends who had done enough. Terra was quieter than it had ever been. The palace had become a city of craftspeople and archivists. The walls that had once echoed with sermons now rang with the sound of chisels and laughter. The custodians still patrolled the halls, but without their weapons. They were simply men in gold who helped carry beams or offered water to the workers. Their armor no longer gleamed, it was matte, the color of old sunlight. Inside the sanctum, the throne remained where it had always been. The frame was bare now, stripped of cables and shrines, left open to air and time. No one called it holy. It was simply beautiful. The breaker sphere still rested beside it, untouched. A reminder of the day something infinite had chosen to end. Sometimes people came to sit there in silence. They did not kneel. They just breathed. One night, the custodian returned to find a child sleeping on the dais with a data slate clutched to her chest. He knelt, lifted it gently, and read what she had written. It was not scripture, not even a story, just a list of names written in the clumsy hand of someone learning her letters. When she woke, he asked her what it was. She said, "Everyone who helped me get here." The custodian nodded and placed the slate beside the breaker sphere. "Then they are home," he said. The next morning, a comet passed over Terra. It wasn't prophecy. It was ice-catching sunlight. But the people stopped to watch it anyway. For the first time in 10,000 years, no one saw it as omen or weapon. It was just something beautiful moving through the dark. And somewhere beyond all hearing, beyond the warp, beyond the reach of stars, something vast and patient stirred, not to rise, but to rest deeper. It had learned what every god must learn in time, that faith is only light until it becomes warmth, and warmth is meant to be shared. The silence between stars endured, and in that silence, life sang softly back. They started calling it the Age of Unmaking because it was easier than admitting they didn't know what they were making instead. The old titles had lost their weight. Segmenta still existed on parchment. High Lords still signed decrees with seals that impressed wax better than mines, and fortress monasteries still cast long shadows at dusk. But the center that held those shapes together was gone. What remained was the work of hands. On Terra, the sanctum's doors stayed shut while the city outside learned to breathe without a throne. The custodian who had watched the last light fall now walked the outer walls at dawn with a cup of broth, nodding to the masons, the gardeners, the scribes who copied lists of grain instead of edicts. He remembered the way the chamber had sounded when engines ruled it. He preferred the quiet. Across the void, the heartline beat with the patience of tide. Ships moved to its rhythm, never in straight lines, always in arcs that resembled care. A battered transport out of Armageddon limped along that pulse and found a line of beacons laid by strangers. Each buoy stocked with water and a single note. "We were here." The crew added their names to the file and left tools in the locker for the next ship. They were Astra Militarum by habit and farmers by need, carrying seeds taken from an agri-moon that had taught them the math of rain. When they made orbit around a dead world, they didn't blacken it with banners. They walked the ground until their boots found places that listened. They planted. The first shoots rose without anthem. Someone laughed because the green looked like hope even when coated in dust. The Adeptus Mechanicus did not die. It molted. The great forges still glowed, but their song was lower. Litanies shortened to checklists. A young tech priest on Metallica scraped centuries of incense from a cooling tower and discovered the metal beneath had not hated them. He wrote a treatise that began with sin and ended with lubrication schedules. His mentor called it heresy, until a turbine spun cleaner than it had in living memory. After that, The forge let the paper stand on a public lectern. Pilgrims came to run their finger along the margin where a greasy thumb had left the only blessing the new age required. Rumors became the gravity that held human maps together. Some told of a figure in plain robes walking the eastern fringe, fixing pumps and never taking credit. Some said a shard of the Emperor's will drifted in the Imperium like a cool current. Not a light, not a voice, only a temperature change that made the demons avoid lanes when people were kind to each other. Others swore the Adeptus Custodes had taken a new oath not to a corpse or a chair, but to the act of refusing despair. None of it was proven. All of it was useful. Truth in the age of unmaking was measured by the lives it kept. The warp did not love this. It sulked. Its storms rose and fell like moods without audience. Astropaths learned to braid their messages through the quiet places, singing softer than breath and getting more across than 10 millennia of shouting ever had. One choir on a pilgrim ship discovered that if they recited the names of the living instead of the dead, the message arrived whole even through weather that had eaten fleets. They stopped asking permission to keep that ritual. No one punished them. The galaxy's appetite for punishment had finally exceeded its supply. The Astartes who stayed learned smaller wars. A squad of space wolves put away their oaths of endless hunt to teach a thawing world how to read tracks that weren't made by beasts. A sergeant of the Imperial Fists rebuilt a wall so well that the wind changed direction around it, and the village behind it learned, for the first time, to sleep through a winter night. He etched no sigil into the stone. The villagers carved one anyway, small, near the base where only children would notice it and tell each other stories about the quiet giant who measured twice and cut once and whistled while he worked. The Inquisition hollowed to its core and kept only what it could prove was necessary. A lord of the Ordo Malleus stood above a pit where a demon had once been, and told her acolytes the only sermon worth repeating. Do not give the dark your fear for free. Then she closed her book and spent the rest of the day helping dig a new well, because water was the only argument that mattered in that heat. Her rosette went back in its box. She did not miss its weight. On Silentius, the settlement built from ship hulls watched the sky for storms and found fewer each year. They kept the empty shrine empty. Children dared each other to stand on its threshold at dusk and listen. You could hear the heartline there, they said, clearer than anywhere else, not because the world was holy, but because the wind used the old fissures as an instrument and played a rhythm that matched the chest. An elder taught them a rule that fit on a single slate. Remember what you are. Do what you can. Clean what you use. Leave a light. Terra did not proclaim a new age. It simply lived into it. The palace's outer wards filled with workshops and small theaters where actors told the old epics in voices that made room for silence between victories. The sanctum remained closed, a room at the center of the human map where no one needed to go in order to feel it work. Once a season, the doors opened for a day. Not for relics, for dusting. People came with rags and brushes and gentle hands. They polished the frame of the golden throne until it reflected faces instead of faith. The breaker sphere sat on its cloth and refused to be more than itself, a last kindness engineered by a mind too tired to allow worship to finish the job. At night, when the city's heat cooled enough to think, the custodian walked the perimeter one more time and listened. He heard forges humming low, a fountain hitting a clean bowl, the scuff of boots on stone where a patrol changed watch without yelling orders. He looked up and found the sky bright enough to map by. A comet scratched its quiet line over the horizon. He thought briefly of the Hall of Victories, of banners so heavy they used to pull the air down. He breathed in, breathed out, and said what he had said on the day the light died and what he would say on the last day of any world that ever tried to hold together without a god. They are trying. He could not hear the heartline through armor and old scar, not like the choir trained and the navigators did, but he felt it in the bones the genecraft had not erased. The beat matched his footfall. He adjusted his pace and let the world set the cadence. It felt like being led across a bridge you've already crossed and trust enough to cross again. It was centuries before anyone dared to name the age that followed, and when they finally did, the word sounded more like gratitude than prophecy. Unmaking had never been destruction. It had been release. Layer by layer, humanity shed the armor it had built to survive its own worship. The Imperium became myth, not erased but softened, a story recited by fireside to remind children why humility was stronger than power. Terra grew green again. Gardens filled the fractures left by bombardment. Water returned to its channels and flowed through old streets where once parades of death had passed. The palace remained, the bones of a monument now used as library and observatory. The custodians who still walked its halls were teachers, not guards. They wore their gold not as symbol of might but as reminder of endurance. Some kept the old silence. Others began to speak of things smaller than empires. The taste of bread baked by civilian hands, the sound of wind against marble too long deafened by ceremony. On Mars, the forges changed color. Rust was no longer a shame, it was proof that machines aged like people. Tech priests learned the joy of decay, of watching systems wind down properly rather than burn out in worship. They built less and repaired more. They stopped embalming engines in prayer and began listening to the rhythms within them, hearing for the first time how harmony sounded when it wasn't demanded by doctrine. The heartline never vanished. It ran beneath everything, quiet and steady, as if the galaxy itself had remembered how to breathe. No one owned it, no one could command it. Navigators described it as a kindness you can steer by. Ships followed it not to reach a destination, but to stay close to one another, like constellations that had learned to move as flocks. And on the edge of the old maps, where light thinned into guesswork, a single transmission began to circle through the void. It was faint but clear, a voice without distortion, without title. "This is humanity," it said. "We are still here. We are smaller now, and that is good. We do not call for rescue. We call to tell you that the dark is bearable." The message repeated every 72 hours, then paused for breath. In the warp, that breath became a ripple. It brushed against the remnants of what had once been chaos, powers grown brittle and hungry from millennia of worship. And they recoiled. The darkness that had thrived on mankind's endless need found itself starved by sufficiency. The gods of the Eye of Terror weakened, not from defeat but from neglect. A demon that had once torn through reality to mock prayers now drifted through a stormless void, whispering fragments of hymns it no longer understood. Even nightmares, when unmade, dream of peace. Back on Silentius, 100 generations after Captain Varen's first landing, the settlers held a festival each year to mark the day the pulse had first been heard. There were no speeches, only lights, thousands of them strung across the black glass plain to form the pattern of a heartbeat. Children raced between the lanterns laughing, unaware that their joy was what kept the stars so steady above. The custodian never lived to see that celebration, but the world owed him its tone. In his final days he asked to be buried without rank, his armor melted down into tools. "If anyone remembers me," he said, "let it be because I helped carry something heavy." When they lowered his ashes into the soil, the ground trembled, not from grief, but from resonance. Somewhere, the heartline skipped a single beat, then continued as before. Millennia later, an explorer ship found the breaker sphere drifting alone in space. It had cracked open. Inside there was nothing but dust and a single etched phrase, so small that only machine eyes could read it. "When the work is done, rest." The crew logged the find and left it where it was. They had other things to repair. That was how humanity entered its truest era, not of conquest, not of empire, but of continuation. There were still wars, still storms, still loss, but in every fight there was a pause between volleys where one soldier might look at another and say quietly, "We keep each other alive," and the words would sound like a prayer even though they were not one. The emperor was gone. The throne was empty. The stars still burned. And across 1,000,000 worlds, the children of mankind lifted their faces to the dark and smiled, not in defiance, but in understanding. For the first time in their long, blooded history, they were not waiting for salvation, they were living it. The galaxy never ended. It just learned how to be quiet. For 10,000 years, mankind mistook survival for purpose. We called obedience faith. We called silence devotion. We built cathedrals so loud that we forgot what a heartbeat sounded like. And when the light went out, when the God we'd built from memory finally stopped pretending to breathe, we thought the dark would eat us. It didn't. It waited. And in that waiting, we hurt ourselves. The Imperium fell the way winter ends, not with fire, but with thaw. Statues cracked and bled into gardens. The engines that had kept a corpse alive became forges for the living. The golden throne, stripped of its cables, stood naked under sunlight for the first time since humanity still knew the word hope. It was smaller than legend had promised. That was what made it beautiful. The Emperor did not rise again. He did not whisper across the void or shape storms with unseen will. He simply ended, and in that ending he gave us what he could not give while alive: permission to continue without him. Now the stars hum with a new rhythm, the quiet, steady sound of people trying. Not saints, not heroes, not chosen sons, just hands that mend and eyes that lift. The heartline beats through the dark, unowned, uncommanded, unafraid. It is the sound of a billion small mercies holding a galaxy together. If there is a heaven, it is not a throne. It is a workshop, a garden. A ship kept running by those who learned that divinity was never in the light. It was in the endurance. So if one day you look up, and the sky feels too wide, listen carefully. That pulse you hear beneath the silence isn't a god's, it's yours. It's ours. It's everything still trying, and that is enough. The last light of the Astronomican flickers only once. Across the cold void of the Imperium, every ship that ever trusted that golden fire feels it vanish. Not fade, not dim, but die. For 10,000 years that beam has been faith made visible. The pulse of a corpse god chained to a throne of machines. Now there is only darkness. On Terra, billions fall to their knees, praying to a light that no longer answers. On distant worlds, navigators claw their own eyes, screaming at the sudden silence where the Emperor's voice once lived. The galaxy holds its breath, and in that silence something begins to move. Something older than empire. Something that waited for the day the god of mankind would finally stop pretending he was alive. If the light dies, truth will follow. The Imperium will learn what it worshipped was never life, only endurance. But endurance breeds monsters. What happens when the god that held them together ceases to exist, and the galaxy remembers it was always at war? Stay with us. Like this signal, share it, and subscribe your vigilance. In a universe built on faith and fear, the end of one god is only the beginning of another. It began as a tremor, too small to notice, like the breath a dying man takes before the stillness. Deep beneath the palace of Terra, the machinery of the golden throne hummed its endless prayer. For 10,000 years that sound had never stopped. Not once. Not even when wars burned across the solar system, or when the custodians fought in the Hall of Victory to keep the faithful from tearing down the doors. But on that day the hum faltered. The light inside the sanctum dimmed. Servitors paused mid-chant, unable to complete the syllables of a litany no one remembered writing. Tech adepts froze as the data streams that fed the Emperor's machines flickered like dying embers. The throne, built from the bones of an empire and the fear of extinction, had finally exhausted its will to endure. Across the throne room, the Adeptus Custodes stood motionless, gold armor dull beneath the sickly glow. They had no words for what they saw. They were bred for obedience, carved to defend, not to feel. Yet as the Emperor's breath, if breath it could still be called, left him for the final time, even they felt something hollow open within their hearts. The master of mankind, their god, their father, their prisoner, was gone. Outside the sanctum on the plains of the imperial palace, the choir of 1,000 psychers screamed as one. Their minds, once tethered to the Astronomican, snapped under the strain of sudden silence. Blood poured from their eyes, running down their faces like tears of molten glass. The light that had burned in the warp for millennia, the beacon that had guided every ship through madness, winked out. The void beyond Terra darkened, and the Imperium felt its heart stop. In the hive cities below, billions felt it without understanding. Vox networks overloaded with shrieks of static. People collapsed in the streets, clutching icons that no longer glowed. The ecclesiarchy called it a test. The Inquisition called it treason. The people called it the end. On Mars, the tech priests of the Omnissiah gathered around the data altars of the Noctis Forge. They watched the readings fall to nothing. The energy streams from Terra going dark one by one. Some tore the flesh from their own faces in despair. Others began to chant in reverse as if undoing prayers could undo fate. They had always believed the Emperor was the machine god made flesh. Now, faced with the truth of his silence, they found only emptiness inside their circuits. In the deep void, navigators awoke screaming. The third eye, that strange inheritance of mutation, once flooded with the light of the Astronomican, saw only darkness. Warp storms that had slept for centuries stirred again, spreading like veins of poison through space. Whole fleets vanished. Worlds dependent on supply lines from Terra were cut off within hours. The galaxy fractured in the span of a heartbeat. On the bridge of a battle barge above Cadia's grave, a space marine of the Imperial Fists knelt before a flickering projection of the Imperial Aquila. He had fought for centuries knowing that the Emperor's will guided his aim, that every bullet was sanctified by divine purpose. When the signal died, the silence that replaced it felt like betrayal. He removed his helmet and stared at the stars. "Father," he whispered, his voice breaking through the voxlink, "why now?" In the Schola Progenium, children raised from birth to praise a god they'd never seen sat in silence, their hymns forgotten mid-verse. The instructors continued the ritual of instruction for several minutes before realizing the words no longer held power. Faith without a flame was just sound. And somewhere beyond the veil of reality, in that great ocean of madness called the Warp, the absence of the Emperor's light became a wound. Demons, starved for millennia, felt the leash fall away. The warp storms churned like a sea breaking free of a dam. Where the Astronomican once burned, there was now a void that pulled everything toward it. It was not darkness as mortals knew it. It was hunger. It was memory. It was the space left behind by divinity. The custodians did not move for hours. When they finally spoke, their voices echoed softly in the dead chamber. "What now?" one asked, his tone stripped of ceremony. Another replied, "We keep watch." The first nodded, eyes fixed on the motionless figure upon the throne. "For who?" No one answered. Outside, Terra burned its prayers into the sky. Cathedrals filled with incense until the air became poison. The faithful tore apart the unbelievers in the streets, convinced that doubt had killed their god. The ecclesiarch himself fell to his knees before the sealed gates of the Sanctum Imperialis, screaming for the custodians to open the doors. When no answer came, he tore his vestments and cried to the empty heavens, "Father, forgive us, we believed." But faith could not bring warmth to a dead sun. Hours became days. The light did not return. The High Lords of Terra convened in silence, each refusing to be the first to speak the words they all feared. "He is gone." In the data vaults beneath the palace, servitors continued to transcribe the litanies of the throne, unaware that the system they praised no longer functioned. They wrote the same lines over and over, their quills scratching out eternity in ignorance. And far beyond the reach of any censor, in the heart of the warp where time folds over itself, something stirred in the darkness where the Emperor's radiance had been. A voice like memory whispered across the abyss, not to the faithful, not to the gods, but to the void itself. At last, I rest. The silence that followed was perfect. The Imperium did not understand it yet, but history had ended. What came next would not be history, it would be remembrance. The age of light was over, the age of silence had begun. The first scream came from a navigator. His ship was mid-jump when the Astronomican died, and for a heartbeat his third eye looked straight into a universe without a map. That scream rolled outward. A chain reaction carried through astropathic networks like a ripple through water. On Terra, the choirs answered it. Millions of psychers, some trained, most broken, began to cry out as one. They didn't know what they'd lost, only that something vast had stopped listening. In the palace, silence clung to the air like dust. The custodians still guarded the throne, though the corpse they called God was nothing but lightless flesh. 100 servo arms hovered motionless above the machinery, their rites unfinished. No alarm sounded. The systems were too sacred to admit failure. It was only the smell that told the truth, a scent of burnt ozone and old blood rising from beneath the armor plating. Down in the cathedrals, the ecclesiarchy chanted louder as though volume could replace divinity. Pilgrims beat their heads against the marble floors until the stone ran slick with devotion. Some priests declared that the Emperor's silence was proof he now spoke directly to their souls. Others called it a lie and drew blades. Within a day, the shrines of the Adeptus Ministorum burned brighter than the suns they orbited. In orbit above Holy Terra, the fleets waited for command. Voxlinks returned only static. Astropaths fell into comas, their minds burnt clean. Captains looked to the black void and found it deeper than before. Without the Emperor's light, the warp had turned wild again, a sea unchained. Whole convoys vanished trying to reach Mars. On that red world, the tech priests worked themselves to madness. They opened the sealed archives, chanting prayers not heard since the Great Crusade. Some claimed to see ghost patterns in the data, a pulse echoing from the throne even as it cooled. They called it the last beat of the machine god. Others called it the voice of the Omnissiah warning them to prepare the resurrection. For 3 nights the solar system trembled. Warp storms bloomed where no storms had been, painting the sky with auroras of impossible color. The moon sang with magnetic grief. Then, at the end of the 3rd night, the light of the Astronomican blinked back once, brief, cold, final. Every sensor, every navigator, every whispering astropath felt it. A heartbeat that was not life but memory. On the throne, the Emperor's eyes opened. No one saw it happen, though the custodians swore later they felt the weight of his gaze. They did not dare look up. The lids moved once, a spasm or perhaps a choice. The corpse inhaled without lungs, and a whisper crawled through the chamber thin as smoke. Remember. Then the light died for good. Across the Imperium, that single word carried farther than any signal. It was heard in dreams, in static, in the hush that follows bombardment. On dying worlds, soldiers whispered it like prayer. On prosperous worlds, nobles pretended they hadn't heard it at all. The word meant everything and nothing. Remember what? The throne? The man, the lie? In the warp, the demons paused. Something about the silence unsettled them. It wasn't victory. It was vacancy. A predator prefers the sound of prey. This quiet was too complete. Some whispered that the Emperor's soul had not vanished but dispersed, scattered across the immaterium in shards of golden fire. Others said he had fallen into true sleep and would dream the galaxy anew. Both were wrong, but belief made them real enough. Terra became a mausoleum. The custodians sealed the palace gates, their faces hidden behind mirrored helms. No pilgrim was allowed within 100 leagues. The High Lords argued in darkness, unwilling to speak aloud what their hearts already knew. The Imperium had survived 1,000 wars, 1,000 betrayals, but it had never known an ending. In that new airless quiet, even the machines seemed to hesitate. Servitors stopped mid-task, their biological minds confused by a command that no longer existed. Voxcasters repeated the same unending message, a wait signal from Terra. But no signal came, and somewhere beyond the reach of any astropath, on a barren moon forgotten since the heresy, a single figure in ancient armor stirred. The light of a dying sun glinted off his helm. He looked up as if listening to a voice that no longer spoke. Then with slow, deliberate motion he began to walk. The age of silence was over. Something else had begun. The first world to speak the truth was a mining moon at the edge of Segmentum Pacificus, where the sky was always gray with dust, and the only music came from engines that never rested. When the Astronomican died, the miners kept drilling. There were no shrines there big enough to burn and no cathedrals to fill with smoke. They felt the shift in a simpler way. The lifts hesitated. The ore tally froze. The overseer's vox began to repeat the same clipped sentence without meaning. By shift's end, the men and women in stained rebreathers gathered in the loading yard and stared at the blank sky. No one told them what had happened. No one had to. They were not trained in theology, but they knew the taste of a machine that would not restart. The oldest among them, a woman with hands like broken stone, raised her head and said, "It's over." No one argued. They shut down the line themselves for the first time in living memory, and listened to wind move across the slag piles. That sound, small and honest, became their new prayer. On a shrine world orbiting a blue star, the story unfolded in fire. Cardinals declared miracles by the hour. One claimed to see a radiant figure walking the colonnades. One swore the Emperor would rise before dusk. One burned an entire district for failing to shout Amen quickly enough. In the square below the basilica, a young priest took a different path. He climbed the steps, turned his back on the altar, and spoke to the crowd without incense or choir. He told them the truth as he felt it. The light had died. The God they loved was gone. They could keep killing each other to make the grief smaller, or they could stop. It took less than a minute for the crowd to choose. The priest died beneath a bright sky that did not care. In the aftermath, the basilica stood empty, its doors open to clean air. By nightfall, mothers were inside with blankets and food, not to pray but to rest. The statues watched without judgment. Far out on an Imperial cruiser trapped between real space and the warp, a navigator named Lisa lay strapped to her couch, eyes bandaged, pulse a ragged drum. Without the Astronomican, she had nothing to steer by except instinct and fragments of old charts no one trusted anymore. For 2 days she listened to the ship moan around her as if it were an animal trying to crawl toward light. The captain, gray with fatigue, asked for options she could not give. On the 3rd day, when hope had spoiled into quiet rage, Lysa felt something stir at the rim of perception. Not a beam, not a command, but a tone. Gentle. Human. Like the memory of a father singing in a corridor long before the war found him. She turned the ship toward that faint chord and the hull stopped screaming. When they broke from the storm at last, the crew fell to their knees in gratitude. Lysa did not. She kept her bandage on and sat very still. The tone had not said, "Follow me." It had said, "Remember." Back on Terra, the High Lords finally spoke. They wrapped their fear in ceremony as they always had, and declared a period of absolute silence to honor the Emperor's renewed meditation. Orders went out to burn any heretic who said the word death near a vox. Astropaths received blank parchment stamped with wax and told to transmit the stamp. The Administratum renamed the failure of every system a temporary sacred pause. Paper multiplied. People starved. The custodians did not comment. They sealed the inner doors and posted double guards who never moved. Pilgrims beat their hands bloody on the outer gates and sang until their throats tore. Nothing opened. On Mars, a forge temple deep under the dust found a sound hidden in the throne's last data pulse. A pattern, not a command string or a power key, but a rhythm that matched the beating of a human heart at rest. The Magos who heard it wept grease down his cheeks and ordered a halt to all resurrection rites until they could decode the beat. His acolytes called it treason. He called it maintenance. They compromised the only way they knew how. They lowered the volume of the litanies and kept listening. In the lower foundries, rank-and-file tech priests took the rare gift of quiet and repaired machines that had screamed for decades. The manufactura ran smoother for one night than anyone could remember. On a black ship drifting without orders, the psychers in chains felt the leash fall. Some went mad in joy and burned themselves into ash. Some begged for guidance from dead stars. One girl, too young to have survived the collection except for a freak kindness in a petty officer's heart, sat cross-legged in her cell and held her breath until she could hear only the thud in her chest. "If you can hear me," she whispered to no one, "I forgive you." The walls did not answer. Something in the warp, colder than any demon, listened and did not move closer. The last scene of that first day did not happen on a battlefield or in a palace. It happened in a farmhouse on a compliant world no one had ever named in a song. An old woman and a child stood in a doorway and watched the sky lose its last color. The old woman had seen many emperors in her time. Governors, generals, preachers, commissars, all of them wearing gold in places where kindness should have been. She had believed in none of them except the idea that tomorrow would still arrive. She put her hand on the child's head and said, "Tomorrow will still arrive." The child nodded because the hand was warm. For one heartbeat, that was enough to keep the galaxy from breaking. The first weeks after the light died were measured not in days, but in absences. Warp traffic stopped. Vox routes turned to static. Whole systems went dark and stayed that way. The only thing that still moved was rumor. On Necromunda, the underhivers said the stars had blinked and forgotten to open their eyes again. On Armageddon, regiments still fought orcs out of habit, not faith. They didn't know the God Emperor was gone. Only that no one in orbit was answering the calls for munitions. On 1,000 civilized worlds, people went to work, because that was what people had always done. The bureaucrats stamped their parchment, the scribes copied their forms, but their pens slipped more often. No one could remember who the orders were for anymore. Terra itself turned gray. The air was thick with smoke from the temples that never stopped burning. Pilgrims arrived and never left. They clogged the causeways, living and dying on the same steps. The custodians stayed inside the palace. The Administratum called the silence strategic discretion. The High Lords were already ghosts who met behind closed doors and emerged with nothing new to say. Then came the first collapse. Without the Astronomican, every navigator house sent distress beacons that overlapped and bled into each other until the entire astropathic grid was a single scream. That scream fed the warp. Demons answered it. In the segmentum solar, the void itself shimmered with red lightning. Fleets tried to retreat toward whatever fragments of calm space still existed. The warp storms were patient. They waited and the ships went missing one by one. and yet something survived the noise. A signal, weak but deliberate, pulsed through the broken channels. It was not light. It was rhythm, a slow beat that matched a heartbeat. At first, the tech adepts of Mars dismissed it as artifact, noise from a dying network. But the beat persisted, clean and steady, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. When decoded, it resolved into a single word in binary that no machine should have known. Remember, the custodians heard it too. In their chambers beneath the throne, they stood listening to the pulse echoing through the stone. They did not pray. They had forgotten how. Instead, one of them, the oldest, removed his helm and spoke quietly into the void. "As you command," he said, and no one corrected him. Beyond the palace walls, the pulse grew stronger. Every astropath who still breathed heard it in dreams. Some claimed it was the Emperor reborn, his spirit scattered but awake. Others called it a trap, a mimicry born in the warp to lure the faithful. The Inquisition divided itself between the two beliefs and began to kill each other with the efficiency of old professionals. The Mechanicus listened longer. On the surface of Luna, in the forgotten forges that had once birthed the first custodians, a group of magi traced the pulse through layers of data corruption until they found a pattern buried in the noise. It was not a command string. It was a location, a dead system, a star long since catalogued as lifeless. And in that discovery lay the smallest, most dangerous thing left in the galaxy: hope. They called the world Silentius. It had no atmosphere, no oceans, no reason to exist. A sphere of cold iron wrapped around a dead sun, forgotten even by the cartographers of the Mechanicus. Yet from its hollow heart came the pulse. The fleet that went to investigate was not sanctioned. There were no longer sanctioners left to ask. It was a pilgrimage disguised as a mission. A dozen ships from across a dying Imperium following a rhythm they did not understand. The flagship, Indomitable Will, was a relic of the Great Crusade, its hull patched with the bones of lesser vessels. Its captain, a woman named Varen, had not prayed in decades. She said she was done with gods, but when she stood at the bridge and felt the pulse vibrate through the deck, she whispered, "Father," under her breath before she could stop herself. Her crew pretended not to hear. The approach took 3 weeks through storms that bent time. When they reached orbit, they saw that Silentius was not stone at all. The surface moved. Towers unfolded like antennae, slow and deliberate, as if the planet had been asleep and the pulse had woken it. Data scryers reported impossible readings, organic traces in the iron, vox ghosts repeating voices of the dead, fragments of imperial hymnals played backward. The Adeptus Mechanicus called it heresy made manifest. Captain Varen called it a sign. They sent down a team. No one expected to return. The landing craft touched down on what passed for ground. The soil was black glass that rang underfoot. Every step echoed too long, as if the sound were traveling through endless tunnels beneath the crust. The pulse grew stronger with each stride, crawling up the spine until it synced with the heart. They followed it to a fissure that led straight down into darkness. At the bottom was light, weak, golden, steady. It pulsed once every few seconds, perfectly timed to the rhythm that had called them here. The adepts who had come along began to weep through their respirators. One said the word aloud: "Throne." It wasn't a structure so much as an impression in the stone, the shape of something vast that had once rested there. Around it were carvings in perfect High Gothic script. The first line was a name no one had dared speak for 10,000 years. The second was a date that made no sense, 40 years before the siege of Terra. The third was a question: what becomes of a god when belief ends? Farine reached out to touch the mark, but the air rippled before her fingers could reach it. A figure stood there suddenly, not summoned, not teleported, revealed. Armor dull gold, face lost behind a cracked helm. Not a custodian. The proportions were wrong. It carried no weapon, only a staff worn smooth where hands had held it too long. When it spoke, the sound was old air moving through dust. "You kept the fire," it said. Varen fell to her knees without meaning to. The others followed. The figure tilted its head, studying them with the slow patience of something that had watched stars age. "You think he died?" it said again, the tone almost kind. "You think a body is a god? You think a machine can hold a will?" It stepped forward and the light brightened soft rather than blinding. For an instant they saw what lay inside the cracked helm. Not flesh, not metal, but light shaped like memory. "The throne ended," it said. "The man endured. Varen found her voice. The Emperor? The figure regarded her as if the word itself were strange. A title given to keep you from asking what came before. You have worshipped a story. It is finished now. The adepts began to mutter prayers. One collapsed, whispering that this was a demon. The figure turned toward him and simply said, "No." Then it looked up. The galaxy will forget him as was intended, and in forgetting it will begin again. The pulse surged, filling the chamber, shaking dust from the walls. The figure began to dissolve into that golden rhythm, its edges scattering into sparks that drifted upward through the fissure like embers. Its last words were almost lost in the roar. "Remember what you are. That is enough." When silence returned, the light remained, but it was no longer gold. It was pale and steady like dawn. The adepts took readings they did not understand. Varen stood in that new light and realized she was not afraid. Above them, in orbit, every ship recorded the same signal burst across the Vox, a single heartbeat followed by a whisper. He rests. The fleet returned to a galaxy already too broken to notice. But in the months that followed, scattered worlds reported something strange. The storms around them quieted. Crops grew in poisoned soil. Dreams were clear for the first time in centuries. No one called it miracle. No one called it proof. It was just enough. And on Terra, far beneath the sealed palace, a single custodian heard a sound through the vaults. The faint rhythm of a heart. The heartbeat faded into the stone. The custodian stood motionless beside the throne for hours, listening, waiting for the sound to return. It never did, but the air felt different, lighter, almost clean. He didn't speak of it. To do so would make it smaller, and he knew instinctively that silence was part of the gift. Days passed. Terra stayed gray, but one by one the engines beneath the palace began to quiet themselves. Not through failure, through completion. The reactors that had powered the Golden Throne for 10 millennia cycled down in perfect order, their control runes dimming like candles snuffed by careful hands. The adepts monitoring the gauges thought it was disaster, until they realized the readings weren't falling. They were settling. Balance, not decay. In the great cathedrals, the chanting stopped. Not because it was forbidden or forgotten, but because the voices simply ran out of fear to burn. Pilgrims began to leave the plazas, moving back into the ruins to rebuild the homes they'd abandoned. Someone cleaned the dust from an old aqueduct and water ran again. It wasn't holy water. It was enough. The High Lords finally issued a statement. The Emperor's vigil endures. It was written in a dozen dialects, none of them true. The Inquisition tried to enforce worship as before, but their own ranks had thinned. The warp storms receded slightly. It was as if the galaxy had taken a single, cautious breath. On a barren world at the edge of the Ultima Segmentum, a small farming settlement found a body washed ashore after a storm. A man in simple robes, his hands burned but his eyes alive. He remembered nothing, not his name, not the reason he'd survived. When asked where he'd come from, he only said, "From the light between worlds." They built him a shelter. He worked the fields without complaint. Sometimes when the wind blew, the grain around him bent in the pattern of a double-headed eagle before flattening again. The ecclesiarchy called such stories blasphemy. The Mechanicus called them system errors, but no one could stop them. They spread faster than fear. In the warp, something had changed. The demons that had feasted on despair found the taste sour. Faith had always fed them too. The blind, desperate faith of a species clinging to its dying god. But now that faith was quieter, tempered by doubt, it had edges the warp couldn't hold. The darkness retreated not from holiness, but from indifference. It didn't know how to fight a people who prayed without expecting an answer. On Mars, the Magos who had first decoded the pulse walked alone into the forge's deepest vault. There he found an unfinished engine older than the Imperium itself. He placed his mechanical hand on its cold surface and whispered the same word the pulse had taught him. "Remember." The machine answered by starting, slow and low, a hum that blended with the rhythm of his own failing heart. And across the stars, those who still fought, the Astra Militarum in their trenches, the Astartes in their fortresses, began to fight differently. They still shouted the Emperor's name, but it sounded less like command and more like remembrance. They were not waiting for salvation. They were choosing to stand. The custodian still kept watch over the throne. The body upon it had grown still and small, a man's corpse at last. The armor that had once bound him gleamed faintly, though no light reached it. Sometimes, when the custodian closed his eyes, he could almost hear the heartbeat again. It was not hope. It was continuity, and that was enough to keep him there. Far beyond Terra, the signal continued, weak, constant, the same rhythm echoing through the void. Explorers, smugglers, heretics, pilgrims all heard it sooner or later. None could trace its origin. The Adeptus Mechanicus eventually gave it a designation, the silent frequency. They said it was background noise. But every 70 heartbeats, the tone shifted just enough to form a pattern, a phrase, simple, human, we are still here. And somewhere, in the quiet between stars, something vast smiled, not with pride, not with power, but with peace. The Emperor was gone. Humanity remained. And for the first time in 10,000 years, that was enough. When the light first died, people whispered that it would return. When weeks passed and it did not, they began to make gods of the silence instead. Every world found its own way to fill the void. On Terra, the ecclesiarchy called for calm, then for sacrifice, then for fire. The upper hives became a ring of pyres visible from orbit. Smoke rolled across the palace walls until even the custodians could smell burnt incense through their armor seals. The sermons grew shriller. Cardinals stood on balconies screaming that faith itself would restart the Astronomican, if shouted loudly enough. The faithful believed. They always had. They tore open their own palms and held the blood toward the gray sky as proof of devotion. Nothing answered. In the manufactura of the lower hives, the workers did not shout. They simply stopped. For generations, the rhythm of their machines had matched the pulse of the throne's reactors. When that rhythm failed, so did they. Production schedules fell apart. Rations disappeared. The administratum sent new quotas written in red ink, but no one read them. The enforcers who came to restore order were greeted with the quiet click of safety catches coming off 1,000 lass rifles. The first riot was short and mercifully clean. One factory burned, one overseer hanged. By the third week, entire sectors were blacked out. Terra, the center of mankind, was eating itself in the name of obedience. On shrine worlds, the collapse was louder. Pilgrims who had crossed the void to die in sight of holy soil found themselves stranded. Without the Astronomican, no ship could leave orbit safely. The spaceports became prisons. The priests who had promised salvation through proximity now faced millions of desperate souls with nowhere to go. At first they offered comfort, reciting the same hymns that had once filled them with purpose. When those words failed to stop the panic, they sharpened them into weapons. Blasphemy caused this, they cried. Unbelief killed him. The mob listened. In a single day, half the shrines of the southern continent were reduced to ash. The surviving priest called it purification. The refugees called it murder. Across the void in the Segmentum Pacificus, the chapter fortress of the Crimson Halberds received no orders. Their librarian searched the warp for guidance and found only static. The chapter master gathered his captains in the Hall of Oaths. Until he speaks again, he said, we are his silence. They painted their armor black and cut their vox links, vowing to fight only what they could see. Some said it was discipline. Others whispered that it was despair disguised as duty. Within a month, they had vanished from the records entirely. Faith had been the Imperium's only true currency. Without it, every hierarchy began to melt. Administratum clerks falsified orders to survive another day. Planetary governors declared themselves divine to hold their armies together. On some worlds, the Adeptus Arbites executed anyone caught praying. On others, they knelt beside the condemned. The distinction between heresy and loyalty blurred until no one could remember which side of the Aquila they stood on. The Inquisition noticed first that the old sigils no longer worked. Rosettes failed to unlock sealed doors. Acolytes hesitated before obeying. Authority, once absolute, had become negotiable. On the orbital fortress of Gideon Reach, Inquisitor Halvern ordered a purge of his own retinue after hearing one of them whisper that perhaps the Emperor had meant to die. The purge lasted 3 days. When it ended, Halvern sat alone in a room filled with ash and realized he had proved the heretic right. The Mechanicus suffered differently. For them, belief was circuitry, and the silence of the throne was a machine fault. They dissected it with logic, flayed the code, built models to predict its return. But no algorithm could simulate divinity. Eventually, even the logic engines began to produce scripture instead of data, lines of text repeating a single phrase. He endures as memory. To the priest who read it, this was corruption. To the younger adepts who had lost everything else, it was revelation. They began to paint the words on their augmetics in place of the old sigil of the cog. The great paradox of that age was that in dying, the emperor had made the Imperium honest. Without his presence, men could no longer pretend their cruelty was service. Whole regiments laid down their arms. Some vanished into the wilderness. Others rebuilt cities in silence. A few, unable to imagine life without command, turned to older powers in the warp and found that even demons seemed weary of them. The ecclesiarch himself, once a mountain of silk and conviction, finally stepped onto the balcony of the basilica and spoke the truth that would end him. "The light is gone," he said. "The lie is over. We are alone," and perhaps that was his plan. The crowd below listened, stunned. Then they tore him apart, limb by limb, and carried the pieces through the streets as relics. By dawn, the basilica was empty. The altars were bare. The candles kept burning, not out of faith, but because no one had yet thought to extinguish them. Somewhere deep beneath the palace, the custodian who had heard the last heartbeat stood watch. He heard none of this. He didn't need to. The fall of faith was not a noise. It was the moment when the silence stopped feeling sacred and began to feel like truth. The next break came not with fire, but with hunger. Supply worlds that had fed 100 systems for centuries woke to empty docks and cold silos. The administratum sent ration schedules that could not cross the void. On agri-moons, grain rotted in sealed bins while hive cities starved because no one could steer a bulk freighter through storms that had forgotten their lanes. The Astra Militarum tried to hold order with rifles and curfews, but soldiers eat too. Commissars shot looters at dawn, and then sent patrols out to trade for bread by dusk. Whole regiments began to move like tribes, marching not toward enemies but toward water. The badges on their chests meant less each day. Some still saluted the imperial aquila at sunrise. Others lowered their weapons when they saw the same birds nesting in the crown of a ruined shrine. On forge worlds, the Skitari stood like iron hedges around manufactorums that no longer knew what to build. Without orders from Mars or Terra, the machine priests divided their forges by doctrine. Some preached that all work must continue as before because repetition is proof of faith. Others shut their factor lines and used the idle hours to fix things they had broken by working them too long. In the silence, a few young acolytes found that machines responded better to care than to prayer. Their masters called it apostasy. The machines called it maintenance. The manufacturer that chose care ran warmer and cleaner. Word spread. For a while, that was enough to keep them from burning. Black ships drifted like coffins through dead lanes, their holds filled with psychers who were no longer food for the throne's fire. The crews did not know what to do with them. On one ship, the captain set the chains aside and opened the cells. The psychers did not swarm the bridge. They sat in the narrow halls and asked for news no one could give. A boy no older than 12 asked if he still had to die. The captain looked at the stars and told him to sleep. When a demon finally came for that ship, it found nothing to eat. The fear had burned itself out. Rogue traders became the last thin thread between islands of mankind. Their void ships crept along the edges of storms, trading medicine for stories, ammo for names. They took in refugees without asking their sect or their creed and dropped them where land was greenest. The Inquisition tried to brand them heretic and thief, but the sigil of a rosette meant little at a dock where people had not seen bread in a week. One trader hung a simple sign at his airlock, "We take all." In time, even a few Arbit's squad stood guard there not to stop him, but to point the way. In chapter keeps and fortress monasteries, the Astartes stared at blank astropathic shrines and chose. A few declared new crusades in the old style and drove into storms with banners high, never to be heard again. Others turned inward, becoming hard stones against which their home sectors could break and reform. A lone custodian came once to such a keep, his armor dull, his spear unraised. He spoke to the chapter master in a room without listeners. When he left, the fortress opened its gates. Its librarium was emptied into the streets and the people were told to take what they could read. The books returned in better shape than before. Some came back copied by hand. Rumor grew teeth in those months. Some said Terra had fallen and the custodians had fled into the catacombs with the body of their master. Some said a fragment of the Emperor walked across the eastern fringe in plain robes, fixing wells and saying little. Some said the Adeptus Custodes had chosen a new duty, not to a throne but to the idea that a man alone can be enough. None of these stories had proof. All of them moved faster than any fleet could have. In the warp, a new sound rose under the storms. It was not bright like the Astronomican. It did not demand. Astropaths who had gone blind from grief heard it in sleep. A low, steady note that matched the rhythm of the old pulse on Silentius. Some called it a trick, others called it mercy. A navigator on a blistered gunship tuned her third eye to it and broke a storm cleanly, the ship sliding through the fold like a fish through a wave. When she told the crew what she had used, she did not say the Emperor. She said the Quiet. Her captain wrote it in the log and underlined it twice. The ecclesiarchy tried to keep its shape. Some priests learned to speak without promising. They buried the dead and fed the living and stopped calling either a miracle. Their churches filled with people who had nothing to trade but time. Other priests doubled down on fire and orders. Those churches filled too for a little while, until the smoke choked the doors and the crowds moved on. On one shrine world, a cardinal ordered the custodian statue draped in black and declared that any who looked at it barefaced would be put to the sword. That night someone removed the cloth. By morning no one remembered who had ordered the drape. The Inquisition split along lines that had always been there. Some hunted words like rest and remember, as if each syllable carried plague. Others laid down their seals and took passage on rogue trader hulls under assumed names, to see what the silence looked like from a gutter. A cell of witch hunters arrived on a dust world where a farmer was said to heal with a touch, and found only calloused hands and clean water. They left without drawing their pistols. Their report said, no threat, possible blessing. The word blessing was crossed out by a superior hand, but the ink still showed. Even the imperial aquila changed to the eye. Painters in the hives drew it smaller, not as a sky-swallowing emblem, but as a mark on a door. Here we share. Here we keep watch. No decree made this. It spread because it was useful. A boy in a manufactorum learned to trust a door with a small aquila scratched near the hinge. A platoon on a dead front found soup behind one and took less than they could carry. A Skitari patrol saw one on a hab wall and did not search the rooms behind it. The sign became a way to tell each other, in a language older than litanies, that someone had cared enough to leave light. By the end of the second month, the thing that had felt like collapse began to look like a shape, not order, not yet, but a pattern people could live with. Work done because someone must do it. Prayers said because the saying was better than the shouting. Weapons lifted because the enemy was at the door, not because a distant voice had commanded glory. The High Lords called this drift temporary fragmentation and warned of doom. They were not wrong. Worlds still fell. Demons still ate cities and laughed while they did it. Necrons rose in cold tombs and orcs painted their teeth and came howling for a fight. But the way people faced these old nightmares was new. They did not wait for a god to save them. They put their backs together and saved who they could. On Terra, in the quiet under the palace, the custodian finally spoke to the body on the throne. He said only this: "They are trying." His voice did not echo. The machines did not answer. Somewhere far away, the silent frequency pulsed once and fell still, like a hand squeezed and released. The custodian returned to his watch. In the city above, a fountain ran that had been dry since the heresy, and a child laughed because the water was cold. The first rumors of rebuilding did not come from Terra. They came from a world that had never mattered, a refueling moon whose only faith had been schedules. The first officer of its port authority, a woman who had never prayed in her life, stood in the dockyard and told her workers to start up the cranes again. She didn't quote scripture. She didn't talk about duty. She just said that the machines would rust if they stayed still. The workers obeyed because it sounded like sense. That was how the second age of man began, with someone deciding to keep the lights on. Other worlds followed not from command but from imitation. A hive found that food moved better when gangs called truces. A forge found that cooling metal sounded enough like a hymn to keep the priests calm. The words "as he wills" began to mean "as we can." No decree named this. It spread because it worked. On Terra, the High Lords clung to the old forms. They convened their councils, signed decrees, renamed the silence the Emperor's hidden test. But even the clerks stopped listening. The messages that left the palace were received with polite static. The words reached no one's heart. The world beneath the golden towers was already building a different empire, one of gardens and rubble, of shelters made from the bones of cathedrals. The custodian who kept watch did not intervene. He saw the pilgrims who still came, fewer each year, and let them enter the palace without challenge. They did not ask for miracles. They came to sweep the dust, to patch walls, to light candles for light's own sake. One of them, a child no older than 10, placed a small wooden carving of the Aquila at the base of the throne. The custodian did not remove it. He thought, not for the first time, that perhaps this was what endurance truly meant. Across the void, the Astartes began to change. Chapters that had defined themselves by crusade turned their strength to defense. Others, fewer, quieter, disbanded entirely. A space marine without orders is a terrible thing. But some found peace in simplicity. They helped rebuild walls, harvest crops, guard travelers from bandits instead of demons. Their armor dulled, their banners faded. The Imperium called it decay. The people called it gratitude. For the first time in millennia, a child could see a space marine and not fall to their knees in fear. The ecclesiarchy splintered completely. Half of its worlds went dark, ruled by priests who crowned themselves saints and died defending their titles. The other half found a new tone. Their sermons stopped promising salvation and started describing repair. Hands that fix wounds, words that calm storms, work that keeps the cold away. They didn't call this theology. They called it survival. But the congregations filled again. Even the Mechanicus began to whisper change. When the last of the ancient forges on Mars cooled for lack of sacred oil, a group of acolytes broke the taboo and used water instead. The machine spirits did not scream. They purred. The acolytes wept and said nothing to their superiors. By year's end, half the forges were running on the heresy of care. Beyond the rim, rogue traders mapped new routes guided not by the dead light of the Astronomican, but by the faint hum of the silent frequency. They called it the pulse. It didn't promise safety, but it kept its rhythm. Ships that learned to match it arrived whole more often than not. They painted the new mark, the small Aquila with open wings on their prows, and left it there through every storm. Faith did not vanish. It shifted. Where once people prayed for rescue, now they prayed for endurance, for the strength to keep one another alive until dawn. It was a smaller faith, but purer. The warp grew quieter around it, puzzled by its calm. The demons that prowled near Terra learned that hope without worship was tasteless and drifted elsewhere. And on Silentius, where the pulse had first been heard, the old landing site became a settlement. The descendants of Captain Varen's crew built their homes from ship hulls and mined the black glass for tools. They taught their children a single rule. We remember the light, but we do not wait for it. Every generation built a shrine in the same place, and every generation left it empty. When the first transmission from that world reached Terra decades later, it contained only a line of static punctuated by 2 words. Still here. The custodian listened to it in the dark beside the throne. He didn't send a reply. He didn't need to. The sound itself was enough. No one had ever seen the throne stop breathing. For 10,000 years, its hum had been the heartbeat of mankind, the low mechanical chant that meant the universe still had a center. Even when the Emperor was more myth than man, that sound had remained, an endless vibration of machines too sacred to understand. But now the hum was gone. The custodians heard it first. They had guarded the throne for so long that its rhythm had replaced their own pulse. When it went silent, they felt it like a phantom limb severed. At first, they thought it was a failure of the reactor conduits. Tech adepts were summoned from the inner vaults, their augmetic eyes glowing with disbelief as they read the data scrolls. Everything still worked. Every power line was stable. Every reactor output within safe range. The readings showed perfection, and yet the throne was dead. Deep within the palace, where the air had never known dust, the maintenance servitors halted in perfect unison. Their mechanical hands folded like the fingers of corpses, their eyes going dark. A single line of code appeared across the central monitor in the Chamber of Luminance, written in archaic Gothic, its syntax older than the Imperium itself. Function complete. The adepts didn't understand it. They prayed over it for days, rewriting the same runes again and again, hoping for error. But there was none. The throne had not failed. It had finished. The word spread through the Mechanicus like a contagion, At first, it was spoken only in the deepest catacombs of Mars, where senior magi met in secret to discuss forbidden truths. Then it leaked upward, carried by junior adepts who whispered to their apprentices that perhaps the Golden Throne was never meant to last forever, that maybe the Emperor's body had not been sustained by machine but trapped by it, and that in ceasing the throne had set him free. The ecclesiarchy called it blasphemy. They sent their remaining armies to Mars in fire and fury, but the Skitarii legions, once bound to the will of the Omnissiah, stood aside. Their tech priests refused to open fire on men who prayed to the same silence. By the time the ecclesiarch's warships reached orbit, the forges had already gone dark, the red planet glowing like a dying coal. From its surface, a final message was broadcast before the channels went dead. The machine god rests. Let the hands that built now unmake in peace. On Terra, panic turned to awe. The people had feared the day the throne would fail. But when it did, the world didn't burn. The sky didn't crack. The seas didn't boil. The stars didn't fall. Life simply went on. For the first time in millennia, the palace was quiet enough to hear footsteps echo. The custodians remained at their post. They took turns standing vigil, though there was nothing left to guard but a skeleton of gold and cables. Some of them whispered that the Emperor was gone, others that he was still present, not within the throne but within the silence itself. They disagreed, but none raised a weapon over it. In that way, they honored him more than any war ever had. Outside the sanctum, the last of the tech adepts dismantled the reactor cores with hands that trembled. When they reached the base of the throne, they discovered something they had never seen before. A single human bone, uncorrupted by time, resting among the cables, like an offering. The custodian overseeing the work took it and placed it in a small reliquary of glass. No one dared label it. Days passed. Then, without order or reason, the custodians opened the great gates of the Sanctum Imperialis. No choir sang, no banners fell. The people simply walked inside, one by one, silent. They approached the throne not as pilgrims, but as mourners. Some left candles. Others left tools. One child laid a loaf of bread on the dais and whispered that it was all he had to give. By nightfall, the chamber looked less like a tomb and more like a home, filled with the quiet clutter of memory. In orbit, the fleets turned off their guns. There was no war left to fight for a dead god. The admirals stood before their cracked Aquilas and wondered aloud what purpose remained. A few, remembering the rumors of the pulse, set course for the outer dark where the silence was rumored to speak. Most stayed where they were, guarding worlds that no longer needed guarding. Duty, once divine, had become something simpler, protection for its own sake. And far away, beyond the reach of any loyalist censor, on a world of black glass where the stars reflected like water, a signal began to blink again. Its pattern was slower now, softer. One word repeated through the void over and over until it bled into background noise. Rest. It was not a command. It was permission. The throne was dead. The Emperor was gone. And for the first time since humanity had learned to fear the dark, no one was listening for salvation. The universe was still, and in that stillness, life began to move again. The first cut into the throne's skin was made by a man who had sworn never to touch it. Magos Eminent Rel of Mars walked up the steps with his hood down and his augmetic hands bare, the light from the chamber turning the brass of his fingers to dull amber. He did not chant. He did not burn incense. He looked at the lattice of gold and cable as a builder looks at a bridge long past its last load. And he whispered to the custodian beside him, "If this was a prison, we should learn how it locked." The custodian did not give permission. He did not forbid it. He simply inclined his head, and Rel placed the first tool against the first seam. The sound it made was not a scream. It was a sigh. Panels that had been welded shut before the heresy came away as if held only by memory. Ranks of coiled conduits lay beneath, marked with symbols the Mechanicus had declared too holy to read for 1,000 generations. The adepts gathered around with hand lamps and data slates. Some wept when the old script resolved on their screens into clear, plain instructions. The throne had never been a riddle. It had only been forbidden to understand. Rel moved from plate to plate, calling out what he saw in a steady voice. Load paths here, life support there, psychic dampers arranged not to amplify a soul but to anchor it. It held a man, he said, and the word man made the room lean closer, and it kept him from leaving. They found the first human mark under a crust of dust, a boot scuff at knee height where someone had braced to adjust a panel. Not sacred oil, not sanctified blood, a scuff. Rel put his gloved hand over it and stood very still. He worked on it, he said softly, as if speaking to himself. He stood here and worked on his own chains. The custodian's head tilted just enough to be a nod. In the corners of the chamber, servitors that would once have chanted refrains held their quiet like candles. Word reached the outer vaults fast enough to outrun rumor. Lines formed around the gates not to petition but to help. Engineers from Hive Manufactura arrived with tool crates dented by a lifetime of service. Artisans brought brushes and rags. A woman who kept generators running in a flooded hab carried up a coil of wire and said nothing, set to work, and soon had 3 of the ancient lumen banks shining steady again. When a ministorum deacon began to complain that grease stained the marble, a custodian placed his spear across the man's chest without a word, and the deacon found he had prayers to lead elsewhere. The first real mystery lay in the throne's heart, a sealed housing untouched by any repair record. Rel and his team dragged a crane into place, its caster squealing, its arm trembling as it took the weight. When the cover came free, a wash of cold air spilled out that smelled like old promethium in winter. Inside lay a sphere the size of a man's head, smooth, black, and held in a cradle of simple steel. No script adorned it, no sigil. Only a nick along one edge where some tool had slipped long ago. Rel reached out and laid one brass finger against it. The lights in the chamber dimmed, then steadied. His voice, when it came, was almost human. "A breaker," he said. "A thing you install when you know one day you must shut everything down." He did not lift it. No one did. The custodian wrapped the cradle in a plain cloth from the reliquary table and carried it to a side alcove where the other finds rested. The unlabeled bone, a cracked lens, a length of cable worn smooth where a hand had held it for hours. The alcove had no lock. The watchers were enough. Outside, the news rippled through ranks that had forgotten how to change their minds. Skitari officers read the data and stood down security codes written in fear. Manufacturums began to repurpose tools that only ever went one way. In a fortress monastery on a gray ridge, a chapter master read the report twice, then walked into the Chapel of Oaths and told his brothers that the age of keeping a corpse alive was done. "He does not need our engines," he said. "He needs our courage." The veterans wept without shame. The neophytes learned a new prayer that sounded like a promise. By the 3rd week, the throne's body looked less like a god and more like a machine again. A skeleton of smart angles and cables that could finally breathe. The chamber itself changed tone. Where once choirs had bruised the walls with the weight of their voices, now you could hear the small things, the scratch of a brush, the click of a data slate rune, the hiss of a valve releasing air that had been trapped since the siege. People spoke low. Laughter returned in quick, guilty bursts, and when it did not summon judgment from above, it became a tool like any other, used to lift and carry in the long hours. Someone set a pot to simmer on a little promethium burner near the western pillar, and soon the room smelled faintly of broth. A custodian accepted a cup and found that he could drink without armor seals for the first time in memory. The last circuit to be traced ran beneath the dais, where no one had ever looked because no one had dared kneel. Rel slid on his back with a lamp in his teeth and came up 10 minutes later with his face streaked and his eyes bright. "There's a manual bypass," he said, hidden under the footings. "It cuts the life support and opens the dampers. It is labeled." He turned the data slate so they could all see the ancient words in simple script. "For when it must end." The custodian who had heard the final heartbeat reached out and steadied the Magos' shaking hand. No one spoke for a long time. It was not a trap. It was a kindness left by a man who knew his friends would not let go. That night the sanctum was open to the city again. Not for viewing, not for worship, but for work. Pilgrims swept grit out through doors taller than titans. Children carried buckets. A guardsman with half a hand showed a boy how to coil cable so it would never kink. A woman from a forge-side hab etched the small Aquila mark under the right-hand stair to tell anyone who came after that this was a place you could trust to give you water and not ask your creed. No decree allowed it. A custodian watched and did not stop her. Near midnight, when the burners were low and the floor shone clean for the first time in centuries, the vigil started the way the best things do, without anyone deciding to start it. People set down tools and sat. A former choir psycher who had burnt her voice in service long ago hummed a tune with no words. Others joined one by one until the chamber held a single low note that rose from 1,000 throats and matched the memory of a hum that had once meant forever. It did not summon a god. It steadied hands. In the quiet that followed, the custodian stepped onto the dais and placed his palm against the throne's naked frame. He did not expect anything. The metal was cool and still. He closed his eyes anyway and said, as he had said before, "They are trying." Somewhere beyond Terra, the silent frequency ticked once. A soft pulse felt more than heard, the universe's smallest nod. Dawn found them asleep on the clean floor, leaning on tool crates and against each other like soldiers after a battle. The city outside had not changed. The galaxy beyond still slept with one eye open, but the throne was honest now, and the room around it had learned a new shape. From the far end of the chamber, under a shroud of canvas, the breaker sphere sat in its cradle and reflected nothing. When dawn came to the sanctum, the throne glowed faintly in the pale light. Not with power, not with sanctity, but with a sheen of bare metal warmed by a rising sun that had not touched it in 10,000 years. Dust motes drifted through the beams, turning the air gold for a heartbeat before they vanished. For those who had worked through the night, it felt like something breathing again, not a god, but the world itself. The custodian who had watched since the first silence stood at the top of the dais and looked out over the chamber. The people below were still asleep in small clusters. Adepts curled against tool crates, children leaning on the legs of their parents, guards with helmets resting in their laps. None had come here for miracles, yet the room held the calm that miracles used to bring. He whispered to the empty throne, "It's enough," and his voice did not echo. The machine did not answer, but he did not need it to. In the hours that followed, the dismantling became rebuilding. Engineers mapped every conduit. Artisans polished each plate until it reflected faces instead of prayers. One of the younger magi suggested leaving part of the structure standing, not a shrine, but a school. There was knowledge here, they said, worth more than gold, proof that even gods could end and the world would go on. Rel nodded. "A throne that can die," he murmured, "can teach better than a god that never did." Outside, Terra changed with quiet momentum. The smoke thinned. The rivers under the hive spires began to flow again, gray but alive. In the outer wards, statues of the emperor that had once towered over plazas were lowered with care. No one smashed them. They cleaned the stone and laid it in the foundations of new homes. Each block carried a trace of the old grandeur, buried now under walls made for warmth, not worship. The message spread, sometimes by courier, sometimes by simple imitation. A forge on Mars reopened, its overseer declaring that if the Omnissiah was resting, the least they could do was keep his workshop tidy. A chapter of Astartes, the once proud crimson halberds, painted the right half of their helmets white and declared their oaths fulfilled. They swore new ones to protect any world that remembered the silence with dignity. Across the segmentum obscurus, governors stopped calling themselves divine proxies and started calling themselves caretakers. It was not an empire anymore. It was a stewardship. When the first storm returned to the warp, it came softly, curling around the edge of the solar system like a predator testing a new boundary. But the storm met no fear. Astropaths watched it approach and didn't pray, they planned. Fleets took shelter where they could. Pilots adjusted for gravitational drift and the wave passed without catastrophe. The survivors logged the readings, shared them, learned. It was not faith that saved them. It was attention. One evening, as the chamber lamps flickered, a child asked the custodian a question that no scholar had ever dared to ask. Was he happy? The custodian paused. The armor around his face hid nothing. His eyes were steady but not cold. "I think he was tired," he said. "And when we let him stop, the stars stopped hurting." The child seemed to understand. He took a cog from the floor and placed it in his pocket. "Then we shouldn't build him again," he said, and ran off to play among the pillars. The custodian stayed until the stars came out. When he finally descended the steps, he did not bow. He reached up, unclipped the aquila from his chest and set it on the dais beside the old breaker sphere. The gesture meant nothing official, but in that moment it felt like closing a book. Beyond Terra, signals began to align. The silent frequency, once faint, pulsed clear now, steady, rhythmic, carrying across the void. Ships found one another by its tone. Planets synchronized their chronometers to it. Some called it the heart line. Some called it the echo. but most left it unnamed, as one leaves breath unpraised. In the archives below the palace, the Adeptus Administratum wrote the last line of their final codex on the Emperor's reign. Duration, 10 millennia. Conclusion, fulfilled. Beneath it, an anonymous scribe added in smaller script, "He built a bridge, not a throne." And so the Imperium, the word itself beginning to fade from use, learned to be what it had never been: mortal, finite, present. The universe did not mourn. It simply shifted as galaxies do, slow and graceful, making room for what came next. When the last custodian left the sanctum, he sealed the doors behind him, not to keep people out, but to let the silence stay pure. Outside, morning waited. He looked once at the sun rising over Terra's scarred horizon, and whispered the only benediction that fit a world finally awake. "Rest well, old man. We'll take it from here." The void had always hummed. Even before men named it warp or space, there had been a background murmur, the Astronomican, the flicker of the golden throne, the ceaseless chatter of ships calling to ships. Then one cycle after the throne cooled, the hum was gone. What replaced it was not emptiness. It was clarity. Navigators were the first to feel it. Where once their minds had been blinded by the Emperor's light, now they saw everything. The black rivers of the warp in their true shape, unsoftened, unkind, but honest. Some went mad at the scale of it. Others wept, not from terror but relief. One navigator, old enough to remember the heresy as family legend, described it best. "It's like hearing the sea for the first time after a lifetime of thunder. Ships that learned to listen instead of scream found paths through the storms. They drifted with folded sails, riding the natural tides of the Imperium like ancient mariners following stars. Travel slowed, but it became cleaner. Whole convoys vanished for months and returned without a single Warpborne scar. The void had not forgiven humanity. It had simply stopped arguing with it. Out among the dead sectors, the stars glittered sharper than they had in memory. Astropaths called it the clear dark. They could still send messages, though the voices came quieter now, more fragile, like letters whispered through water. They no longer relied on faith to push them through. They used patience. The greatest miracle of the New Age was that patience worked. In those early years, a silence settled over the broken empire that was not despair but pause. Planets once deafened by the constant roar of doctrine began to hear their own weather again. Oceans moved. Wind returned. Cities built for worship learned the sound of markets, the rhythm of boots on stone, the laughter of people who had survived themselves. Without orders from above, governors became caretakers. They stopped reciting decrees and started keeping lists of things that still grew. On one frontier world, a Vox station picked up a rhythm in the static, a slow pulse that matched the beat of a human heart. The technician on duty, a girl barely 20, recorded it out of habit. When she replayed the file, she heard faint harmonics like breathing. Her supervisor told her it was feedback. She didn't argue, but she kept the file and played it once every night before sleep. It was comfort, nothing more, until ships in other sectors began to report the same tone. Not identical, but in key. The void was full of heartbeats now, scattered and overlapping like a conversation conducted across infinity. The Mechanicus refused to classify it as phenomenon or signal. They called it the residual echo. Pilgrimages started again, not to Terra but to the space between. Crews left ports without destination, guided by the echo's rhythm. They carried no idols, no relics, only offerings of grain, water, and time. Some returned with logs filled with coordinates of habitable worlds. Others never came back. Their names were written in the margins of new maps beside quiet suns. Those who studied the data noticed that the echo grew stronger, wherever people cooperated instead of conquered. It was as if the universe had begun to reward gentleness, in ways small but precise. Ships arriving a little early, engines running a little smoother, wounds healing that should not have. The old enemies did not vanish. Orcs still roared across the void, delighted that mankind had gone quiet enough to hear their laughter. Necrons woke in their tombs and watched with alien patience. Tyranids drifted through the dark, tasting less faith in the air and finding it thin. Chaos, robbed of the Astronomican's psychic glare, grew sluggish like predators deprived of scent. Their incursions did not cease, but their shapes blurred. The warp storms no longer opened cleanly. Demons came through, distorted, half-formed, confused by the silence. A soldier on a border world wrote that the horrors still screamed, but softer now as if they too were mourning. Through it all, the Heartline kept time. People began to build their clocks by it. It was faint, steady, and different to borders or creed. The Adeptus Mechanicus tried to triangulate its origin. The results formed a circle that encompassed everything humanity had ever touched. They declared the data inconclusive. The people declared it beautiful. And in a small ship adrift near the eastern fringe, an astropath named Cain dreamed of the golden throne one last time. In his vision, it was empty, covered in dust and morning light. A single figure stood beside it. Not the emperor, not a saint, only a man in plain robes sweeping the floor. When Cain asked who he was, the man smiled and said, "No one important. Someone has to keep it clean." When Cain woke, he was crying and did not know why. The silence between stars was not absence. It was inheritance. The maps changed first, not the star charts in administratum vaults, which would take centuries to admit error, but the sketch maps on mess tables and the chalk scrawls on cargo bay bulkheads that told crews where they'd lived and where they might live next. Lines that had once run straight from Terra flared outward like roots seeking water. Ships traced the Heartline, pausing where the beat felt strongest, marking worlds not by edict but by ease. Air that tasted clean after a storm, soil that held a footprint instead of swallowing it, nights where dreams carried no teeth. A new way of knowing took shape, less a network than a nervous system, alive because it was humble. On a cold agri-world in the Gothic sector, spring arrived late and mean. The wind cut through coats and the ground held the freeze like spite. The people there had burned their shrine years before, not in anger but to heat a barracks. They planted anyway. The first green shoots came up crooked, then steadied. A week later, a rogue trader limped into orbit on a drive patched with scrap and intention. He brought nothing rare, tools, seed, a handful of medica kits, and asked for nothing back. When he lifted off, he left behind a box of vox crystals tuned to the Heartline. The farmers began to set their work by its pulse, and for the first time since anyone remembered, the harvest came in even. They called the beat the keeper. They taught their children to clap along with it when storms rolled in. A forged subspindle on Vos Prime chose a different path. Its Archmagos declared the Heartline a disease and sealed the sector's gates. Machines, he said, must obey code or fail. Rhythm was noise by another name. His Skitari enforced the quarantine with perfect aim. For a season, the manufactorum ran like a hymn sung too loudly. Output soared. Breakdowns multiplied. Workers slept at their posts and did not wake. When the first reactor hiccuped, the Archmagos ordered more discipline. When the second cracked, someone painted a small aquila on the control console and turned down the litanies. The third reactor held. The Archmagos called it randomness. His acolytes called it proof. Among the Astartes, the silence cut deep and clean. Some chapters took it as a chance to sharpen, to become the old blade again. They hunted in the dark with the old hunger. They died well and early. Others learned the quiet. A captain of the salamanders knelt beside a collapsed hab and dug with his gauntlets until a child coughed dust and reached for his thumb. He did not speak the Emperor's name. He did not have to. Down the bay, a veteran of the Iron Hand stood before an assembling crowd and removed a perfect augmetic hand he had worn for 3 centuries. He placed it on a table and told the people to use it as a tool until someone needed it more than the table did. It was the first time an Iron Hand had called a machine ours and meant people. Astropaths adapted in ways no one expected. Denied the Astronomican's glare, their craft became tender. They learned to braid messages through the soft parts of the warp, avoiding storms instead of defying them. They sang quieter and got more across. In the choir holds, where once the air had stung of copper and fear, the new work gave them back their names. A woman who had forgotten hers learned to write it again on a strip of cloth and tied it to the rail by her couch. She sent a single word to her sister on a mining moon, bread, and the word arrived whole, carried on the back of a lullaby. The sister baked and waited by the dock until a trader took the loaf in the story. When the loaf reached the choir hold, it was stale and perfect. They ate it like a sacrament that needed no altar. In the eastern fringe, a Xenos fleet ghosted along the edge of the silence. Not Necron, not Orc, not any foe with a familiar shape. Its ships were thin as knives and moved with patient grace, taking nothing, measuring everything. An Imperial patrol, undergunned and shaken, prepared to die. The Xenos altered course instead. They left behind a buoy that broadcast the heartline on a frequency no human had scanned. The patrol's commander, who had lived long enough to distrust luck, logged the event without adjectives and set a guard. The buoy pulsed for a month and then went dark, as if it had delivered a message to a place no one could see.